Dodge City, Kansas, 1878. The saloon doors never stopped swinging in a cattle town, and Preston Gallagher had learned long ago that the West was no place for softness. At 25, he had already buried two partners to frontier violence and watched a wildfire consume his family's Montana homestead when he was 17. The lesson was carved into his bones. Attachment meant pain, and love was a luxury that got men killed. He kept his dark hair short beneath his wide-brimmed hat, his jaw clean-shaven to better feel the wind's warning, and his heart locked tight as a bank vault. He sat alone in the Long Branch saloon, nursing whiskey that burned less than his memories, when the door opened to admit a gust of Kansas wind and something far more unsettling, a young woman with golden blonde hair pinned in a simple bun, wearing a faded calico dress that had seen better seasons. She was perhaps 22 years old and beautiful despite the exhaustion etched around her cornflower blue eyes. But what struck Preston silent was the small girl clinging to her skirts, no more than 5, with the same blonde hair and a face that held equal parts hope and fear. The saloon fell quiet, men turned away, the bartender's face hardened. "We do not serve your kind here," the bartender said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Respectable establishment." The young woman Clara Abbott, Preston would later learn, lifted her chin with a dignity that made his chest ache. "I am simply looking for work. Cleaning, cooking, anything honest." "Honest?" a gambler laughed, cruel and sharp. "That ship sailed when you had a bastard child hanging on your skirts, honey. No decent folk want a fallen woman scrubbing their floors." The little girl pressed her face against her mother's dress, and Preston saw Clara's hand shake as she smoothed her daughter's hair. But her voice remained steady. "My daughter's name is Sarah, and she is the finest thing in this world. I will thank you to speak respectfully or not at all." Something cracked in Preston's chest, a fissure in the wall he had built brick by brick. He had watched his own mother face down a claim jumper with the same fierce dignity before the man's bullet found her heart. He had sworn never to care enough to feel that pain again. Attachment was weakness. Love was liability. But he found himself standing, his chair scraping loud in the silence. "The lady is with me," Preston heard himself say, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down rustlers and lived to tell the tale. "Anyone has a problem with that can step outside and we will discuss it." No one moved. Preston had a reputation as quick with his fists as he was fair in his dealings. He was a top hand on the Diamond Cross Ranch, and even the gamblers knew better than to push a cowboy who could rope and ride anything that breathed. Clara turned to him, those blue eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been the first stirring of hope. "I do not know you, sir." "Preston Gallagher, ma'am, and that does not matter. I know what it is like to be alone in this territory." He tipped his hat to the little girl, "Miss Sarah." Sarah peeked out from her mother's skirts, curiosity winning over fear. "You are a real cowboy." "I suppose I am." Preston felt his mouth curve in a smile he had not worn in months. "And you look like you and your mama could use a hot meal. I know a boarding house run by Mrs. Henderson. She is always looking for help, and she does not judge a woman's past." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. "Why would you help us? You do not know anything about me." "I know you stood up for your daughter when the whole room was against you. I know you are looking for honest work instead of the easy kind, and I know that little girl looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." Preston picked up his hat from the table. "That is all I need to know." The false belief whispered in his mind even as he escorted them into the dusty street. "This is a mistake. Attachment leads to pain. The frontier will punish you for caring." But Sarah slipped her small hand into his with such trust that the whisper faded beneath the unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat at the edge of Dodge City, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and roses struggling in the Kansas heat. The proprietor was a widow who had lost her husband to cholera on the wagon train west, and she measured people by the content of their character rather than the mistakes of their past. "Can she cook, Mrs. Henderson asked, her sharp eyes assessing Clara. "I can cook, clean, mend, and work harder than any 2 people you have ever met," Clara said, her spine straight despite the dust on her hem and the weariness in her face. "I require room and board for myself and my daughter, and enough wages to eventually move into our own place." She has spine, Mrs. Henderson said approvingly to Preston. I like that. When can you start? Right now, ma'am. The room at the back is small but clean, meals 3 times daily, and I pay $2 a week once the trial period is done. Mrs. Henderson's voice softened slightly. I do not care about your past, girl, but I care deeply about my present. You work hard, you treat my boarders with respect, and we will get along fine. Clara's relief was palpable. Thank you. You will not regret this. After they had settled Clara and Sarah into their room, Preston found himself lingering in the boarding house kitchen, hat in hands, unable to quite make himself leave. Clara had emerged to begin preparing the evening meal, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender forearms marked with old burn scars, evidence of hard work and harder times. You did not have to do this, Clara said softly, peeling potatoes with practiced efficiency. Sarah sat in the corner playing with a corn-husk doll, humming tunelessly to herself, but I am grateful beyond words. It was the right thing to do. Preston leaned against the doorframe, trying to understand why leaving felt impossible. How long have you been on the road? 3 weeks. We came from Abilene. Clara's hands never stopped moving, potato peels falling in long ribbons. Sarah's father died 2 years ago. We were never married, which makes me a fallen woman in the eyes of polite society, but he was a good man who was killed in a ranch accident before we could make it official. We had been getting by on charity and odd jobs, but the church ladies in Abilene decided Sarah would be better off in an orphanage, that I was an unfit mother because of my unwed status. Her voice cracked on the last words, and Preston saw the fierce love and fear in her expression. I took her and ran. I will not let them take my daughter. I will work myself to the bone before I let that happen. They will not take her, Preston said, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. The attachment he had sworn to avoid was already forming, and he could not seem to stop it. Mrs. Henderson is well respected here. If you work for her, you have standing in the community. And if anyone tries to say otherwise, they will answer to me. Clara looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Preston felt something shift between them, an understanding, a recognition. 2 people who had been battered by the frontier but refused to break. Why do you care? Clara asked. The truth, please. Preston was silent for a long moment, watching Sarah play with her doll, humming her tuneless song. The truth was dangerous. The truth meant admitting the walls were cracking, but something in Clara's direct gaze demanded honesty. I have spent 8 years believing the only way to survive out here was to need no one, he said finally. I watched my mother die protecting our claim. I lost partners to stupidity and violence. I decided attachment was weakness, that love would only bring pain. He met her eyes. But watching you stand up for your daughter in that saloon, I remembered there are things worth fighting for. Worth risking pain for. I suppose you reminded me I am still human underneath the armor. Clara's eyes glistened. I thought I was alone in believing love could exist out here. Everyone says the West is too hard, too brutal for softness. But Sarah is the best thing I have ever done, and loving her makes me stronger, not weaker. You are right, Preston said, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. I have been wrong. The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility. Over the following weeks, Preston found reasons to visit the boarding house with increasing frequency. He brought Sarah peppermint sticks from the general store. He helped Clara carry water from the well when Mrs. Henderson's back was aching. He taught Sarah to braid rope and told her stories of his years working cattle drives north to the railheads. Clara bloomed under the stability and kindness. Her cheeks regained color and her smiles came easier. She was a remarkable woman, intelligent, hardworking, and possessed of a dry wit that caught Preston off guard and made him laugh in ways he had forgotten he could. She was 23 years old, she told him one evening as they shelled peas on the back porch while Sarah chased fireflies in the yard, and she had never expected to find friendship again, much less whatever was growing between them. Is it friendship? Preston asked, emboldened by the soft twilight and the peace of the moment. Because I find myself thinking about you at the strangest times. When I am breaking a horse, I wonder what you are cooking for supper. When I am night herding cattle, I see your face in the stars. Clara's hand stilled in the bowl of peas. Preston, I am damaged goods in the eyes of this town. I have a daughter born out of wedlock. I have no money, no prospects beyond scrubbing floors. You could have your pick of proper young ladies from good families." "I do not want proper young ladies," Preston said, setting aside the bowl and taking her hand. Her fingers were work-roughened and strong, and they fit perfectly in his. "I want you, you and Sarah both. I know it is fast, I know we have only known each other a month, but out here, you learn to recognize what matters. And you matter, Clara, you both matter more than anything has mattered to me in 8 years." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I am afraid to hope. Everything good in my life has been taken away. Sarah's father, our home, my reputation. What if I let myself love you and lose you too? What if you do not?" Preston reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "What if we build something strong enough to weather whatever the frontier throws at us? I cannot promise we will not face hardship, but I can promise I will face it beside you every day for as long as I draw breath." Clara kissed him then, soft and tentative and full of hope she was afraid to fully embrace. Preston held her carefully, aware of the precious gift of her trust, and made a silent vow to prove himself worthy of it. But the frontier had a way of testing vows. 2 weeks later, Preston was in the Long Branch saloon picking up supplies for the ranch when a stranger walked through the doors. He was tall and lean, dressed in the dark clothes of a circuit preacher, and his eyes scanned the room with the cold assessment of a man hunting prey. "I am looking for a woman named Clara Abbott," the stranger announced. "Blonde hair, traveling with a young daughter. I have been informed she came through Dodge City." Preston's blood ran cold. He kept his expression neutral, his hand casually near his gun. "Why are you looking for her?" "I am Reverend Thomas Shaw from the Church of Righteous Mercy in Abilene. Miss Abbott is an unfit mother who has kidnapped her daughter from the proper authorities. The church elders have determined the child should be placed in a Christian orphanage where she can be raised in a moral environment, away from the influence of a fallen woman." The saloon had gone quiet again, men watching to see how this would play out. Preston felt fury burn through his veins, hot and righteous. This was the threat Clara had feared, the danger that haunted her dreams, and he would be damned before he let this cold-eyed hypocrite tear apart the family that had become more precious to him than his own life. "Miss Abbott is a respectable woman working for Mrs. Henderson," Preston said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is a good mother who loves her daughter, and she has friends in this town who will not take kindly to you spreading lies about her character." "The law is on my side," Reverend Shaw said coldly. "I have papers from the church elders and a letter from the county judge in Abilene. The child belongs in an orphanage." "The child belongs with her mother." Preston stood, and several other cowboys from the Diamond Cross Ranch stood with him. "And you are not welcome in Dodge City. I suggest you get on the next train back to Abilene and tell your church elders that Clara Abbott and her daughter are under the protection of this community. If you try to take that little girl, you will have to go through every man in this saloon." The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "You are making a grave mistake, Mr. Gallagher. The law will come for her eventually." "Then let it come. But it will find a woman with a steady job, a stable home, and a whole town willing to testify to her good character." Preston stepped closer, using his height to advantage. "You have no power here, Reverend. Leave." "Now." Reverend Shaw left, but his parting look promised this was far from over. Preston ran all the way to the boarding house, his heart pounding with fear and determination. He found Clara in the kitchen, and one look at his face made her go pale. "He found us," she whispered. "Oh God, he found us." "Listen to me." Preston took her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I will not let them take Sarah. Do you understand me? I will not let it happen." "How can you stop them?" "He has the law on his side." Clara was shaking, her worst fears realized. "I should run again, take Sarah and disappear before." "No," Preston's voice was iron. "Running will only make you look guilty. We fight this the right way. We get married." Clara stared at him, shocked, speechless. "Marry me, Clara, right now today. If you are my wife, if Sarah is my daughter through marriage, the law is on our side. A married woman with a stable home and a husband with steady work, no judge in Kansas will take a child from that." Preston pulled her close, his heart pounding. "I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I love you and I love Sarah, and I want to be a family. Not just to protect you from the Reverend, but because the past 2 months have been the happiest of my life." Because when I think about my future, all I see is you and Sarah and building a home together. You would do this, take on another man's child, tie yourself to a fallen woman, make yourself a target for the church's wrath. Clara's voice broke. Preston, they could make your life hell. Let them try. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Say yes, Clara, say yes, and let me stand beside you. Let me be the family you and Sarah deserve. Yes, Clara sobbed, clutching his shirt. Yes, yes, yes. They were married that afternoon by the justice of the peace, with Mrs. Henderson and the ranch foreman as witnesses. Sarah stood beside her mother in a new dress Mrs. Henderson had sewn for the occasion, her face shining with joy as Preston knelt down and asked her seriously if it would be acceptable for him to be her papa. My real papa is in heaven, Sarah said solemnly. But Mama says we can love lots of people and there is always room for more. So yes, please, I would like you to be my papa very much. Preston hugged her tight, this brave little girl who had stolen his heart as surely as her mother had, and felt the last of his walls crumble to dust. Attachment was not weakness, love was not liability. This fierce, terrifying, overwhelming love was the entire point of surviving the harsh frontier. What good was survival if you had nothing worth living for? They moved into a small house at the edge of town that very night. It was hardly more than a cabin, but Preston had saved his wages for years with no idea what he was saving for. Now he knew. He was saving for Clara's joy when she saw the little garden plot, for Sarah's delighted shriek when she discovered she had her own small bedroom, for the feeling of coming home to people who mattered more than his next breath. Reverend Shaw returned 3 days later with the county sheriff from Abilene in tow. They arrived at the house to find Preston repairing the fence while Clara hung laundry and Sarah played in the yard. It was an image of domestic tranquility that stopped the sheriff in his tracks. "This is the fallen woman?" the sheriff asked the reverend, taking in Clara's simple wedding ring and the tidy home. "She appears to be a respectable married lady." "She was not married a week ago," the reverend snapped. "This is clearly a ruse to avoid the church's rightful custody of the child." "You have proof of that?" Preston asked mildly, though his hand rested on his gun. "Because what I see is a man harassing a married woman on her own property. What I see is a man making unfounded accusations about my wife's character, and I take that very personally, Reverend." The sheriff sighed. "Reverend Shaw, I came all the way from Abilene because you claimed this woman was unfit and had kidnapped her daughter, but she is clearly married now with a stable home. The law does not separate children from married mothers without evidence of severe mistreatment, and I see no evidence of that here." "This is a mockery of Christian values," the reverend sputtered. "She is a sinner who is under my protection now," Preston interrupted, his voice hard as Kansas granite, "and you are on my property without invitation. Leave. And if you come back, I will have you arrested for harassment." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Reverend, your business here is concluded. The lady is married and has a home. The court in Abilene has no jurisdiction over a married woman in Dodge City." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am, Mr. Gallagher, I apologize for the intrusion." They watched the men ride away, and only when they were specks on the horizon did Clara let herself collapse against Preston, shaking with relief and residual terror. "It is over," Preston murmured into her hair. "He has no power over you anymore. You are safe. Sarah is safe." "Because of you," Clara looked up at him, her eyes still wet but shining with something stronger than tears. "You saved us, Preston. You gave us a life when everyone else wanted to tear us apart." "You saved me first," Preston said simply. "You reminded me what it means to be human, to feel. To care about something beyond mere survival." They stood there in the Kansas sunshine, holding each other while Sarah played nearby, and Preston felt a peace he had not known since childhood. This was what mattered. This was what he had been running from all these years, not danger, but the vulnerability of loving someone so much that losing them would destroy you. But he understood now that the vulnerability was inseparable from the joy. You could not have one without risking the other. And Clara and Sarah were worth every risk. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Preston's life. He continued working at the Diamond Cross Ranch, but now he rode home each evening to Clara's cooking and Sarah's excited stories about her day. Clara had become friends with several of the other ranch wives, women who admired her strength and had no patience for the Reverend's judgment. Sarah thrived, growing confident and joyful under the security of two parents who loved her. But Preston's past was not content to stay buried. He was in town picking up supplies when a man stepped out of the shadows of the livery stable. He was dusty from travel, wearing a marshal's badge and a cold expression that made Preston's stomach drop. Preston Gallagher. That is me. I am Marshal Hendricks from Montana Territory. I have some questions about a fire that burned down the Gallagher homestead in 1870. A fire that killed your father and destroyed evidence of land fraud claims. Preston went very still. My father died in a wildfire. There was no fraud. That is not what the current landowner claims. He says your father forged the land titles and that you set the fire to cover the evidence before fleeing south. Marshal Hendricks pulled out a wanted poster with Preston's face on it, younger and more desperate but unmistakable. There is a reward of $500 for information leading to your arrest. I aim to collect it. The world tilted. Preston had been running from this for 8 years, telling himself it was not true, that no one would care about an old land dispute. But someone had cared, someone had waited until he had something to lose before striking. I did not set that fire, Preston said, his voice low and urgent. My father's claim was legal. The man who took our land after was the one committing fraud. He threatened us, tried to drive us off, and when we would not leave, Preston stopped, the memories choking him. He set the fire. My father died trying to save the house. My mother was killed 2 months later when she tried to fight the false claim. I ran because I was 17 and terrified and knew no one would believe me over a man with money and connections. That is a touching story, the marshal said flatly. But I have a warrant with your name on it. You can come peacefully to Montana to face trial, or I can arrest you here and drag you back in chains. Your choice. Preston thought of Clara and Sarah, of the life they were building together. He thought of his wife's trust and his daughter's love. He thought of the false belief that had governed his life for 8 years. That attachment meant pain, that love was a liability. And he realized he had been right, love did make you vulnerable. But it also made you strong. I will go to Montana, Preston said, but I need to speak to my wife first, 1 hour, then I will surrender peacefully and go willingly to face whatever comes. The marshal studied him. You have 1 hour. But I will be watching. Try to run, and I will bring you in chains, and your wife will face charges for harboring a fugitive. Preston ran home, his heart in his throat. Clara was in the garden with Sarah, and the sight of them laughing in the afternoon sun nearly broke him. But he had to tell her. He owed her the truth. Preston, Clara looked up, her smile fading as she saw his expression. What is wrong? He told her everything. The land fraud, his father's death, his mother's murder, the 8 years of running. He told her about the marshal and the warrant and the trial waiting in Montana. He watched her face as the words poured out, waiting for disappointment or fear or judgment. Instead, Clara took his hands and held them tightly. Did you set the fire? She asked. No. I swear on my life, on Sarah's life, I did not. Then we will prove it. Clara's voice was calm and determined. We will go to Montana together, and we will prove your innocence. You stood by me when the Reverend came. Did you truly think I would do any less for you? Clara, the trial could take months. The ranch will not hold my job that long. We could lose everything. Preston's voice cracked. You and Sarah would be better off if I just... Do not, Clara's eyes flashed. Do not you dare suggest leaving us. We are a family, Preston Gallagher. We face this together or not at all. Sarah had crept closer during the conversation, her small face worried. Papa, are you in trouble? Preston knelt down and pulled her into a hug. Yes, sweetheart, but not because I did anything wrong, because someone is lying about me, and I need to go far away to prove I am telling the truth. Can we come with you? Sarah asked. Your mother says yes, but it will be hard and scary, and I do not know how it will end. Preston looked at Clara over Sarah's head, his heart full of love and fear and determination. I was wrong to think I could protect myself from pain by avoiding attachment. I was wrong to believe love made me weak. You two are my strength. You make me braver than I have ever been because I have something worth fighting for. They left for Montana 3 days later, after selling the little house and settling their affairs in Dodge City. Mrs. Henderson wept when they said goodbye but pressed a bundle of food and money into Clara's hands with strict instructions to write once they were settled. The journey north was long and difficult. They took the train where they could and traveled by wagon where they could not. Sarah was brave through it all, treating the journey as an adventure, asking endless questions about Montana and mountains and what a trial would be like. Preston told her about his childhood homestead, the mountains that touched the sky, the rivers that ran so cold and clear you could see every stone on the bottom. He told her about his mother's garden and his father's pride in their land claim. He told her the truth about good people being hurt by powerful men who lied. But the truth wins in the end, right, Papa? Sarah asked as they crossed into Montana territory. That is what Mama always says. The truth matters. I hope so, sweetheart, Preston said, though he had seen enough of frontier justice to know that truth often mattered less than money and influence. I truly hope so. The town of Bitterroot was smaller than Dodge City, nestled in a valley between mountains that stole Preston's breath with their beauty and broke his heart with memory. This was home, or had been, before fire and death and lies had driven him away. The trial was set for 2 weeks after their arrival. Marshal Hendricks kept Preston under house arrest in the town's small boarding house, allowed freedom of movement but required to check in twice daily. Clara spent the time investigating, talking to old neighbors and searching land office records, driven by a fierce determination to prove her husband's innocence. What she found was a paper trail of fraud and intimidation. The man who had taken over the Gallagher homestead, Silas Hartwell, now a wealthy rancher with holdings throughout the territory, had a history of forcing out small landholders through threats, violence, and suspicious fires. He had connections to the territorial judge who had issued the warrant, and he had paid handsomely to have the investigation point toward Preston rather than himself. But Clara also found witnesses. A former ranch hand of Hartwell's who had been present the night of the fire and had fled after seeing too much. A land office clerk who remembered Hartwell bribing officials to falsify records. An old neighbor who had seen Hartwell's men surveying the Gallagher property days before the fire. They were all terrified of testifying against a man as powerful as Hartwell. But Clara had a gift for seeing the good in people and appealing to their courage. She reminded them of what they had lost to men like Hartwell. She told them about Sarah, about building a life despite fear and hardship. She showed them that ordinary people could stand against corruption if they stood together. One by one, they agreed to testify. The trial took place in a packed courtroom, with half the territory turned out to watch. Silas Hartwell sat in the front row, confident and cold, certain his money and influence would carry the day. The prosecutor laid out the charges with practiced efficiency. Preston Gallagher had forged land titles and, when caught, had burned the evidence and killed his father to cover his crime. It was a damning narrative. But then Clara's witnesses took the stand. The ranch hand testified about watching Hartwell's men set the fire and hearing them laugh about how the squatter kid would take the blame. The land office clerk testified about the bribes and falsified records. The neighbor testified about Hartwell's threats and the suspicious timing of the fire. And then Clara took the stand herself, calm and eloquent, describing Preston's character and the life they had built together. She spoke about a man who had risked his reputation to defend a fallen woman and her child, a man who had faced down a corrupt preacher and married her knowing it might cost him everything. A man whose first instinct was always to protect, never to harm. My husband is not perfect, Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the silent courtroom, but he is good, and he is innocent of these charges. I know this because I know him, his heart, his courage, his essential decency, and I am asking you to see what I see. A man who has been running from a lie for 8 years, who has finally stopped running because he has something worth standing for. Please give us justice, give us truth. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Preston sat with Clara and Sarah, holding both their hands, trying to memorize the feel of them in case this was the last time he would know their touch. He had made peace with whatever came next. Loving them had been worth the risk. Worth everything. When the jury returned, the foreman was an old rancher with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes. He looked directly at Preston as he spoke. We find the defendant not guilty of all charges. The courtroom erupted. Clara burst into tears, clutching Preston as if she would never let go. Sarah cheered and several spectators applauded. The judge banged his gavel, but he was smiling. "Mr. Gallagher, you are free to go, and Mr. Hartwell," the judge's smile vanished. "You will remain in this courtroom. The marshal has some questions about your involvement in land fraud and arson." Preston watched as Silas Hartwell was led away in chains, his face purple with fury. Justice had been slow, but it had come at last. The truth had mattered after all. In the days that followed, the territorial government restored the Gallagher land claim to Preston's name, along with a formal apology for the wrongful accusation. The homestead itself was gone. Hartwell had torn down the burned buildings and built his own structures, but the land remained, 300 acres of Montana Valley with mountains standing sentinel. Preston stood on that land with Clara and Sarah beside him, looking at the place where his childhood home had stood. The grief was still there, would always be there for what he had lost. But standing beside it was hope, bright and tenacious as prairie grass after fire. "We could rebuild here," Clara said softly, "make new memories on this land, give Sarah the mountains and rivers you grew up with." "We could," Preston pulled them both close. "Or we could file a homestead claim somewhere new, start completely fresh with land that holds no painful memories, build something that is ours alone." "What do you want, Preston?" Clara asked. He looked down at his wife and daughter, at the family he had been terrified to want and now could not imagine living without. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a Dodge City saloon where he had seen love in a young girl's eyes for her mother, to this Montana Valley where love had finally brought him home. "I want wherever we are together," Preston said. "That is all I have ever really wanted. A place to belong, people to love who love me back. You and Sarah, you are my home. Everything else is just geography." Clara kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Then let us choose new geography. Let us file a claim near Bitterroot, close enough to honor your past but far enough to build our future. I want Sarah to grow up where she can see mountains, and I want her to grow up knowing her papa was a man brave enough to face his past and strong enough to choose love over fear." They filed a homestead claim on 200 acres of valley land with a creek running through it and mountains rising to the east. The Diamond Cross Ranch in Kansas sent Preston a letter of recommendation that helped him secure a job on a local ranch, with wages enough to support his family while they built their homestead. Clara took in sewing and sold her preserves at the general store. Sarah started school and made friends who never knew or cared that she had been born before her mother's marriage. They built a cabin with their own hands, Preston and Clara working side by side to raise walls and lay floorboards while Sarah fetched nails and tools. It was hard work, harder than anything Preston had done on cattle drives, but every board they placed felt like laying the foundation of something permanent. Something that would last. Their first winter in the cabin was harsh, with snow that piled higher than the windows and cold that bit bone deep. But the fire stayed warm and they stayed warm together, and Preston learned that the frontier was not too harsh for softness after all, not when you had people to share the burden, not when love gave you reason to weather the storm. Spring came with wildflowers and running creeks and Sarah's 7th birthday. They celebrated with cake Clara had bartered eggs for and a doll Preston had carved himself, with yellow yarn hair like Sarah's and a painted smile. "She is beautiful, Papa," Sarah breathed, clutching the doll to her chest. "The most beautiful doll in the whole world." "Not nearly as beautiful as you, sweetheart," Preston said and meant it. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed clutching her new doll, Preston and Clara sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Clara leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly that had become visible in recent weeks. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "Boy or girl?" "I do not care one bit," Preston said, placing his hand over hers. "As long as you and the baby are healthy, as long as we are together." "We will be," Clara smiled up at him. "I am not afraid anymore, Preston. For so long I was terrified that everything good would be taken from me. That loving you and Sarah would make me vulnerable to unbearable pain, but you taught me that the vulnerability is worth it, that love is not a weakness, it is the whole point." Preston kissed her forehead, his heart so full it ached. "You taught me that first, you and Sarah, standing in that saloon with the whole town against you. I saw the love between you, and it cracked something open in me I thought had died years ago. You saved me, Clara." You gave me a reason to be human again instead of just surviving. We saved each other, Clara said. That is what love does. It makes us brave enough to face the world because we are not facing it alone. Their second child, a boy they named Thomas after Clara's father, was born in early autumn. He had Preston's dark hair and Clara's blue eyes, and Sarah was immediately devoted to her baby brother, singing him her tuneless songs and helping their mother with feedings and changings. The homestead grew with their family. Preston and Clara planted apple trees and a kitchen garden. They built a barn and acquired chickens, a milk cow, and 2 horses. Their neighbors, other homesteaders trying to make a life in the Montana Territory, became friends and allies. They helped each other with harvests and barn raisings, sharing the burden and the joy of building something new. Preston's reputation as an honest, hardworking man spread through the valley. When Sarah turned 10, the other homesteaders elected him to represent their interests in Bitterroot's town council. It was not a position he had sought, but it was a mark of respect that humbled him. He was no longer the boy who had run from accusations and fear. He was a man who had faced his past, proven his innocence, and built a life of integrity and love. Clara's sewing business grew until she was supplying half the territory with her work. She hired 2 other women whose husbands had died or abandoned them, giving them work and dignity and a chance to support their children. She never forgot what it felt like to be judged and dismissed. She never forgot the cowboy who had seen past society's condemnation to the love in a young girl's eyes for her mother. And Sarah grew into a confident, kind young woman who never doubted she was loved. She knew she had 2 fathers, one in heaven who had given her life, and one on earth who had chosen her as surely as if she carried his blood. She understood that family was not always about shared genetics, but always about shared love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Clara stood on the porch of their homestead in the evening light, watching Sarah teach 6-year-old Thomas how to braid rope. 2 more children, twin girls born 3 years earlier, played near the garden, their laughter floating on the mountain breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked softly, "taking on a fallen woman and her illegitimate child? Your life would have been simpler if you had walked away that day in the saloon." Preston turned to her, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands, not for one single second. "You and Sarah, all of you, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You taught me that love is not a liability. You taught me that being vulnerable enough to care is what makes life worth living. You taught me that the frontier is not too harsh for softness. It just requires us to be soft together, so we are strong enough to face whatever comes." Clara's eyes filled with happy tears. "I love you, Preston Gallagher. I loved you when you defended me in that saloon. I loved you when you married me to protect Sarah. I loved you through the trial and the hardship in every moment since, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Preston said, and kissed her as the Montana sun set behind the mountains, painting their homestead in gold light. "You and Sarah gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to stop running and start living. You are my home, Clara. You always will be." They stood together on their land, surrounded by the children whose laughter was the soundtrack of their days, and Preston felt the bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey from that Dodge City saloon to this Montana homestead had been longer and harder than he could have imagined, but every step had been worth it, because a young girl had loved her mother, and a cowboy had been brave enough to see that love and honor it. Because attachment was not weakness but strength, because the frontier was not too harsh for softness, it was simply waiting for people courageous enough to choose love anyway. And that courage, that simple, revolutionary choice to love despite the risk, had transformed everything, had given Preston and Clara and their children a life that mattered, a home that would stand for generations. A legacy of love that would outlast any hardship the West could throw at them. They had faced down corrupt preachers and false accusations. They had endured judgment and hardship and fear. But they had endured together, and that had made all the difference. The sunset faded to twilight, and stars began to emerge over the mountains. Preston called the children inside for supper, his voice carrying across the homestead they had built with their own hands and hearts. Clara lit the lamps in their cabin windows, warm light spilling into the gathering dark. This was home. This was family. This was the happy ending they had fought for and earned through courage and love and an unwavering commitment to stand together against whatever came. And it was everything Preston had never dared hope for, and more than he could have ever imagined.